Starting with the Book of Nephi, the Book of Mormon tells a historical story about a Hebrew family that flees the city of Jerusalem around 600 BC. The father's name was Lehi. 1 Nephi chapter 5 verse 14 says of Lehi that he knew that he was a descendant of Joseph, yea, even that Joseph who was the son of Jacob. Though he was younger, Lehi's son Nephi was the most righteous, and therefore became the leader of his rebellious brothers. Nephi records in 1 Nephi chapter 17 verse 8 that, "The Lord spake unto me, saying, Thou shalt construct a ship, after the manner which I shall show thee, that I may carry thy people across these waters." After the ship was completed, Nephi says, "We did put forth into the sea, and were driven forth before the wind towards the promised land." In verse 23, Nephi describes the final leg of the year-long journey. He writes, "After we had sailed for the space of many days, we did arrive at the promised land." The notes at the bottom of the page suggest that this Hebrew remnant landed in the Americas about 589 BC. Most LDS scholars have taught that Central America was the landing spot for Lehi's family. Soon after arriving in the Americas, a division happened between Nephi and his oldest brother Laman. From this division, two separate nations emerged. Those who followed Nephi had God's favor and were called Nephites. 2 Nephi 5:21 describes the Nephites as being white and exceedingly fair and delightsome. The Book of Mormon teaches that the Nephites were a sophisticated people who grew into a large civilization. Helaman 3:8 describes how the Nephites populated the American continents when it says they began to cover the face of the whole earth, from sea south to the sea north, from the sea west to the sea east. Mormon 1:7 says of the growing Nephites, "The whole face of the land had become covered with buildings, and the people were as numerous almost, as it were, the sand of the sea." In all, the Book of Mormon mentions a total of 38 Nephite cities. The other nation grew from the people who followed Nephi's rebellious older brother Laman. They were now called Lamanites. 2 Nephi 5, verses 21 and 24, says of the rebellious Lamanites that, "The Lord God did cause a skin of blackness to come upon them, and because of their cursing which was upon them, they did become an idle people, full of mischief." The Book of Mormon at times describes the Lamanites as being even more numerous than the Nephites, but far more primitive. The Lamanites are said to have lived in tents in the wilderness and hunted wild beasts for food. The Lamanites and Nephites fought against each other for centuries. By the year AD 326, the general of the Nephite army was a man named Mormon. In Mormon 6:2 he writes, "And I, Mormon, wrote an epistle unto the king of the Lamanites, and desired of him that he would grant unto us that we might gather together our people unto the land of Cumorah, by a hill which was called Cumorah, and there we could give them battle." In the final battle on the hill Cumorah, the Lamanites completely destroyed all of the Nephites. Only Mormon's son Moroni escaped alive. After the battle, Moroni described what happened in Mormon chapter 8, verses 2 through 9. He says, "After the great and tremendous battle of Cumorah, behold, the Nephites who had escaped into the country southward were hunted by the Lamanites until they were all destroyed. And my father also was killed by them, and I even remain alone to write the sad tale of the destruction of my people. For there are none save it be the Lamanites and robbers that do exist upon the face of the land." The story ends with the Lamanites being the sole surviving race of people that had come from the Hebrew immigrants of Lehi's family. This is why the title page in the Book of Mormon states, "Written to the Lamanites, who are a remnant of the house of Israel," and why the introduction page in the Book of Mormon concludes that, "After thousands of years, all were destroyed except the Lamanites, and they are the principal ancestors of the American Indians." This explains why the man named Joseph Smith, who said he found and translated this historical story from ancient plates into the Book of Mormon, said of the Lamanites in 1842 that they were principally Israelites of the descendants of Joseph, and that the remnant are the Indians that now inhabit this country. Are Lamanites from the house of Israel really the principal ancestors of Native Americans, as taught in the Book of Mormon and by Joseph Smith? If this is true, the Native Americans would show a Hebrew origin in their DNA makeup.
Skin. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court, Brown v. Board of Education, desegregated all our public schools. In 1964, civil rights laws giving full equality to black Americans. And yet it wasn't until 1978 that the Mormon Church decided to allow blacks to participate fully. Here was the headlines in the papers in June of '78. Mormon Church dissolves black bias. Citing new revelation from God, the president of the Mormon Church decreed for the first time black males could fully participate in church rites. You were 31 years old, and your church was excluding blacks from full participation. Didn't you think, what am I doing part of an organization that is viewed by many as a racist organization?
I'm very proud of my faith, and it's the faith of my fathers, and I certainly believe that it is a faith, well, it's true, and I love my faith, and I'm not going to distance myself in any way from my faith. But you can see what I believed and what my family believed by looking at our lives. My dad marched with Martin Luther King. My mom was a tireless crusader for civil rights. You may recall that my dad walked out of the Republican Convention in 1964 in San Francisco, in part because Barry Goldwater, in his speech, gave my dad the impression that he was someone who was going to be weak on civil rights. So my dad's reputation, my mom's, and my own, has always been one of reaching out to people and not discriminating based upon race or anything else. And so those are my fundamental core beliefs. And I was anxious to see a change in my church. I can remember when I heard about the change being made. I was driving home from, I think it was law school, but I was driving home, going through the Fresh Pond Rotary in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I heard it on the radio, and I pulled over and literally wept. Even to this day, it's emotional. And so it's very deep and fundamental in my life and my most core beliefs that all people are children of God. My faith has always told me that. My faith has also always told me that in the eyes of God, every individual was merited the fullest degree of happiness in the hereafter. And I had no question in my mind that African Americans and blacks generally would have every right and every benefit in the hereafter that anyone else had, and that God is no respecter of persons.
But it was wrong for your faith to exclude them for as long as it did.
I told you exactly where I stand. My view is that there's no discrimination in the eyes of God, and I could not have been more pleased than to see the change that occurred.
Let me talk to